Is Arvind Narayanan, who I embarrassingly misspelled his last name. And he's going to talk about the anonymity of Bitcoin.
Thanks, Rosario. When the organizers emailed me and said they wanted me to speak at the Real World Crypto Conference, I said, really? I know very little about crypto and actually nothing at all about the real world. And to which they said, no worries. How about the first talk? Does that sound good? And so that's how I ended up here. So this talk is going to be, as the slide says, based entirely on research done by other people. I have also done some research on this, but I'm not going to speak about that. Andrew Miller, one of our collaborators, might give a short talk about that. Okay. So what is this about? I want to address the question of the anonymity of the Bitcoin system, which I think a lot of people have been interested in. Before I start, I want to say I seem to have probably the least suspenseful title ever, if you look at the titles of the first and the second talks. In my defense, I didn't know what the other talks were going to be when I gave my title. And also, I get to add to my list of misspellings of my name at conferences, which now stands at 13. Anyway, so the question of anonymity in Bitcoin, right? So here's Bitcoin in like 2 slides if you've never looked at the technical details of the system. For the purpose of understanding anonymity in Bitcoin, all that we need to know is that in Bitcoin, first of all, there are no accounts. Instead, we have addresses. And what are these addresses? They're just public-private key pairs. And I call them pseudonymous, and the reason I call them pseudonymous is that your public key sort of acts as your pseudo-identity. So how do payments work in the system? How does money transfer work? If Alice wants to send some Bitcoins to Bob, Bob has to first tell her what his address is at which he wants to receive Bitcoins. And then, here's a nuance. Bob has to tell Alice something, but Alice now doesn't need to tell Bob something. She doesn't need to connect to his computer and send him Bitcoins. Instead, all that she does is she broadcasts a statement to the peer-to-peer network. It's a signed statement. She can sign it because she has a key pair that says this input address pays a certain amount of value to this output address. And that's really all that happens. Right? And one of the key innovations of Bitcoin, probably the key innovation, is that there is a decentralized peer-to-peer network that keeps track of all of these transfers and all of these balances associated with these addresses in a distributed fashion. And all of this information is recorded completely publicly. Anybody can look at it at any time. And there are various websites that will show it to you. Here's an example of a website that does that. This is blockexplorer.com. There's also blockchain.info. And these are lists of transactions in the system. We don't need to go into the details of this here, but I'm just showing you this to make the point that everything really is public in the system, all of the payments that are made. But, if you look at a list like this, how do you trust that blockchain.info is giving you the right information? How do you know it didn't drop a transaction? Well, that's because everything is, in a sentence, everything is linked together using hashes. And so if they try to modify one transaction, if they try to tamper with one entry, they have to tamper with everything following it. And that, we're assured, is very computationally difficult to do because of the proof-of-work system and because you have to have 51% of the whole network's computing power in order to try to pull any tricks like that. Okay, so that's really all that we need to understand in order to try to answer the question of is Bitcoin anonymous? Now, we've said that your key pair acts as a pseudo-identity, so why would anybody at all expect that Bitcoins would be anonymous? Well, here's the thing. Let's look at WikiLeaks' page. So they tell you right there, Bitcoin is a secure and anonymous digital currency. So a lot of people appear to put trust into the anonymity of Bitcoin, so this seems an important question to answer. Now, one might look at this and think, oh, here's their donation address. It's a long hex string that they've listed there. That's WikiLeaks' address. Poof, anonymity gone, right? So, why is there even a question to answer here? But here's the interesting thing. Notice that there is a button, blue button, right next to that address. What happens if you click on that button? Let's try to click that button. If you click it, what you see is this. The page remains the same, but as you might see, the hex string completely changes. Right? So here's a key feature of Bitcoin. These key pairs, these addresses, are trivial to create. So everybody will simply create a new address for every single transaction. For receiving new Bitcoins, by default, why not always create a new key pair? And that's typically accepted practice. So when one looks at it that way, it might seem that now there is a very high degree of anonymity in the Bitcoin system, because every new transaction you receive at a new address, so you receive money over here, send it out over here, receive money over here, send it out over there, and these will never be linked to the same person or with each other. So it seems like in that sense, Bitcoin is perfectly anonymous. Right? But again, not so fast. Here's the trick. Let's say that Alice wants to make a purchase. She recently, so it's trivial to create new accounts. Does that mean that Bitcoin is anonymous? Let's say that Alice is sitting on certain amounts of Bitcoins in various addresses. Right now, she wants to make a purchase. She's heard in the news that Overstock.com is now accepting Bitcoins as of a couple of days ago, actually. And then she goes to Overstock and she wants to buy a red swing line stapler, which I actually verified is available on their website, and it's listed for a price of, let's say, $8. Actually, given the exchange rate of Bitcoins, that's one damn expensive stapler. Let's assume that the denomination here is really Bitcoins. Okay, so this is the situation. These are Alice's addresses that Overstock now tells her, send the payment to this red address, right, which currently doesn't have any Bitcoins. Now what is Alice going to do? She can't pick any single one of her addresses to make that transaction, so what she's going to do is probably something like this. So she's going to send payment from two addresses, and those are both going to be in a single transaction. So this is a key fact that we need to understand. Typically in the course of payments, your different addresses inevitably get used together. So in other words, shared spending that I just showed you an example of is evidence of joint control over two different addresses. It means that the same party controls those addresses. It's important to avoid the word ownership here, because in the typical use of Bitcoin, you might own some Bitcoins, but another party like Coinbase or another online wallet service that could be the custodian of those Bitcoins. So in this context, we say that Coinbase, in that example, controls those Bitcoins. So as long as we're careful to define things that way, this turns out to be a very powerful idea to try to link different Bitcoin addresses together. Right? So that's key idea number one. But now, think about this. I've just shown you an example where one can look at the transaction graph, which is completely public, and see the evidence of this transaction that was made, and realize that the accounts labeled 5 and 3 probably belong to the same person, or are controlled by the same entity. But the key is that one can apply that repeatedly and transitively. And when one applies it transitively, a whole bunch of addresses might all get clustered together. And that's key idea number two. You can keep collapsing the set of addresses of Bitcoin in a transitive manner. And when you collapse those addresses, we're able to get clusters out of this, millions of known Bitcoin public keys. And many papers have looked into this. And the first paper to look at it was these guys from the UK, Reed and Harrigan. The paper was called An Analysis of Anonymity in the Bitcoin System. And when you start doing these clustering, these very interesting graphs and clusters immediately pop up. Here, what they're applying this to is that in 2011, in June of 2011, there was actually a theft of Bitcoins to the tune of 25,000 Bitcoins, which was worth about $500,000 US at that time, and in today's terms would be worth $25 million. And in fact, the whole history of Bitcoin has been littered with all kinds of thefts and heists and losses and scams. It's kind of like the Wild West out there. Researchers from CMU did a study where they found that of 40 different exchange services, Bitcoin exchange services, 18 had been hacked or experienced losses of some form and had to shut down. So there's a very rich database of these thefts for researchers to study, and they've used these clustering techniques to try to identify information about the person who stole those Bitcoins and the flow of those Bitcoins. So in this paper, for example, they drew charts like this, and they came to some very interesting conclusions I'll tell you in a second. But they stopped short of identifying the thief. They didn't, they really didn't produce an identity, which would have been very cool to see, and that would have gotten us a long way toward conclusively answering the question of whether Bitcoin is anonymous or not. So why did they stop short? Well, it appears that one difficulty is you can cluster all you want, but then how are you going to tie that cluster to a real-world identity? Right? So that's one of the key challenges that researchers have faced in trying to de-anonymize Bitcoin transactions. So why is there any hope at all to imagine that we might find the identities of Bitcoin users? Well, here's something funny. You may have heard of the primary Bitcoin forum, bitcointalk.org. If you look at posts on bitcointalk.org, people very often have signatures, and in those signatures, how to go from clusters to real-world identity, and in these signatures on these Bitcoin forum posts, people often list their addresses. Here you can see in the bottom, the signature with lottery made fun, etc., and he says, he lists his Bitcoin address, and then says, any tip is appreciated. I am an early adopter that lost most of his Bitcoins early on in 2001. Maybe it could even have been the theft analyzed in the paper. I don't know. It's funny. It's like those signs that tell you every penny counts. You're almost expecting a God bless at the end of that. Anyway, so this is one reason that we might expect that people could have their anonymity compromised, because there are these very rich, interesting clusters. A single person has hundreds of addresses. They reveal one of these addresses in the signature in this forum to get tips or whatever, but they don't realize how clusterable this set of addresses is, and the fact that the anonymity of all of their other addresses could also be compromised. So that's possibly one avenue, but not everybody is doing that. What are the other avenues? Another major avenue is exchanges, because sort of one of the choke points of Bitcoin is getting money into and out of the system, right? And when you typically go through an exchange service for this, like Mt. Gox, they probably have your identity. So that's another point at which your identity gets almost inevitably revealed. And the third one is interacting with various service providers in the Bitcoin ecosystem. Some of them may or may not ask for identity, so that's another place in which your identity could be revealed. So we have here a clustering technique and some possible ways to go from there to identity, but that doesn't really answer our question, which is how identifiable are typical users? That's really the question that I want to go after here. So we can identify two extremes in the spectrum of these user behaviors, and one is that these sort of careless users are easily identifiable. At the other end of the spectrum, I want to claim that it's possible to act in a relatively paranoid manner and never reveal your identity to anybody in the course of using Bitcoin. For example, you could only obtain Bitcoins by mining them yourself, which is not a trivial process, but let's say you're one of the miners, or you can buy Bitcoins using cash. That is in fact possible. In fact, in Union Square in New York, there used to be a Bitcoin sort of physical meetup every Monday, 5 to 7, where people would swap Bitcoins for cash. I don't know if that's still going on, but that's one possible way in which you can obtain Bitcoins without ever giving your identity. And maybe you only spend Bitcoins with service providers who don't ask for your identity, and now your identity is never really associated with any transaction. So there's nothing really, almost nothing that somebody could do. So those are two extremes. But what happens with typical users? So we didn't know the answer to this question. People were able to address some pretty interesting questions, though, and there were a whole bunch of papers in the last few years. Here's a partial list that used this clustering technique. And the first one is the UK paper that I told you about, and then Ron and Shamir and Weizmann did an analysis of the full Bitcoin transaction graph, and then there was another paper out of Europe. Okay. So several of these papers used this clustering technique. None of them really took the final step of naming names. It appears that going to real-world identity was still pretty hard. That said, some of these papers did manage to identify some pretty interesting things. Going back to the first paper on that list, the one that looked at the heist of 25,000 Bitcoins, they were able to identify, in my opinion, some fascinating things. So the thief who stole those Bitcoins tried to throw analysts off his trail by trying to create a fake trail that linked that theft to entities who you might expect might be likely to steal Bitcoins. For example, Lulzsec. And the way that he did this, he made a pastebin post here. This is a screenshot from pastebin.com that's still here. And then this is just a long rant that's written very much in the style of Lulzsec. And the fact that he faked this whole thing is very impressive. And it gives you near the top an address for Bitcoin donations. And this address that he has faked here for Bitcoin donations, claiming to be Lulzsec, is actually the address of the thief. So this was one step he took trying to throw people off his trail. And the researchers were able to deduce that this was a fake post by analyzing the transaction graph, and that the theft was not actually committed by Wilson. And then he tried to do another thing, which is he tried to claim that Aaron Barr of HB Gary, right, an odd choice of someone to pick, he tried to claim that Aaron Barr was the person who was the thief. And this is a screenshot from blockchain.info. Blockchain.info uses some very basic techniques to try to associate Bitcoin addresses with real-world identities. And blockchain.info has been completely fooled here. And in fact, it displays Aaron Barr as the owner of those stolen Bitcoins. So in that limited extent, he was successful, but by using these more sophisticated clustering techniques, these researchers were able to go past them. So that's as much as we knew, basically, until a very interesting paper that was published April of last year. But before I can tell you about that, I want to go back to the Overstock.com example to show you another interesting feature of the way that people typically spend Bitcoins. Let's say that Overstock.com is having a sale, and now the price of that swing line stapler drops from 8 millibitcoins to only 7.5. Right? Same scenario, Alice has these 3 chunks. How is she going to pay for that now? Well, here's the interesting thing. Bitcoin only allows you to spend these chunks in an all or nothing form, not partially. Well, that seems like a problem for Alice. She doesn't want to overpay. But now we can make use of the fact that it's trivial to create new address pairs, public-private key pairs in Bitcoin. So the typical idiom in which Alice is going to pay for this 7.5 value is that she's going to create a new green address over there that belongs to her, and she's going to create a single transaction that combines 2 of her inputs and sends 2 values to 2 different outputs, one of which is the intended recipient, and another is a newly created address belonging to herself. Now, the problem with this, and so this is called a change address here. The new address that she created is a change address because she sends back the change to herself. But the problem is, it's difficult to look at the public record, the public transaction graph, and figure out which one of these is the intended recipient and which one is the change address. If we were to somehow solve that problem, it would be a big leap in being able to better cluster these users and hopefully use that to attach identities in a better manner. Right? How can we do that? And so this problem was more or less cracked in a paper at. So I wanted to show you before I tell you that. So the common idiom is, since you almost never have the exact amount of change to pay for a transaction, most transactions in practice are going to have 2 different outputs. And if we go back to that example with blockexplorer.com showing you the list of transactions, you can see that in each entry, there are 2 different addresses in the rightmost column, and that's the phenomenon that you see over there in most cases. So, but there's no particular ordering there. You don't know which one is the intended recipient and which one of those goes back to the original sender. And so this problem was basically cracked by these authors, including Sarah Michaeljohn, who was the lead author, who's in fact sitting in the front row. And it's a bit weird for me to be giving this talk with her sitting there, because I think this is really the most impressive paper on de-anonymizing Bitcoin. And so they used many different heuristics in this paper. The paper goes into painful detail. But one example of these idioms of use that they have tried to identify is that each address is only used once as change. This just happens to be a quirk in the way that Bitcoin implementations function. So here is this interesting thing about this paper. In addition to exploiting fundamental features of how Bitcoin transactions work, they actually did a lot of manual effort in sort of reverse engineering how each service provider and each wallet and each client software works. And they identified patterns in the transactions that occur due to the way that these transactions are typically implemented in software. And so they built a giant list of these heuristics, and then they applied the clustering technique, and something interesting happened. So this is a graph I'm going to show you from the IMC paper. Notice, this graph is different in a key way from the graph I showed you earlier. The earlier graph was the graph of a particular theft of the Bitcoins that this thief stole and where he or she sent them. But this graph is fundamentally different because this is a clustering of all of the major entities in Bitcoin. These are really the biggest transactions and most active addresses on Bitcoin, and most of them really fall very neatly into these big clusters. And if we can somehow tag these big clusters with identities, then we will have gone a long way in trying to associate identities with at least one end of each Bitcoin transaction. Right? So how can we do that? So here's the question. Think about this. So I showed you in the WikiLeaks example that WikiLeaks generates a custom key pair just for you and wants a transaction to be sent to that address, right? So you can't just look on the WikiLeaks webpage and get a hold of WikiLeaks' public key. You have to do something more clever. What is it that you might be able to do? How can you identify WikiLeaks' cluster here? How can you identify Mt. Gox's cluster here, and so on? Well, it turns out that in order to do that, you actually have to transact with each of these services. And they went ahead and did that, and they made 344 transactions with virtually every kind of major service provider out there. And these are some of the items that they bought, and I've never really taken a close look at this before. It's a very interesting set of pictures, cupcakes at the bottom. Were they good? No? Oh, sorry to hear that. So by actually doing this, by transacting with all of these parties, they were able to tag all of these major clusters. You can see, so the big one is a gambling service actually called Satoshi Dice. You can see Mt. Gox on there. You can even see Silk Road on there, a variety of others. So most of the big players in the Bitcoin world have been tagged now. And then they made one more observation that led to their final key claim about de-anonymization, which is this. There's a very high centralization in service providers, and further, most Bitcoin flows seem to pass through one of these in a very traceable manner. So you can at least trace the flow from the point of interest to one of the centralized service providers. And so even if the general public looking at the transaction graph can't identify who it is, any adversary with subpoena power will at least know which provider to go after and compel them to disclose the records. So from the point of view of that adversary, most of these addresses can be identified. So this was the first time that anyone had demonstrated in a concrete manner with respect to any kind of adversary that a typical user of Bitcoin could be de-anonymized, and this was a quantum leap forward. But, well, it doesn't fully answer the question. You could try to ask, what if the user is trying to cover their tracks, right? Well, the answer to this is that a very naive way of trying to cover your tracks doesn't quite work. Why? Because you can use these techniques for clustering transactions, but also following these trails. And here I'm going to show you some graphs from the Ron and Shamir paper. They were able to do this and generate these kind of graphs. And when I was talking to Sarah, she was telling me when she was looking at similar graphs generated by users, she could very clearly follow the trail from a theft or whatever, coming back to, again, a small number of addresses, presumably, or with very high likelihood all owned by the same user. And she was like, come on, really? That's what you're doing? I can see you, who are you trying to hide from? So this technique is not very effective. So this kind of naive obfuscation. Some more charts from the Ron and Shamir paper. And this next one is perhaps proof that computer scientists own large numbers of Bitcoins. You can see a binary tree here. Right? So this looks pretty good in terms of de-anonymization. It looks like we've gotten pretty far. But I want to point out that there are a number of important limitations. One is that this heuristic for clustering addresses together based on change address detection is pretty fragile. And if you make a mistake, what's going to happen is you're going to cluster two different clusters that are very different together, and you're going to think that, oh, Mt. Gox is now the same as Silk Road, right? Which would be a very bad inference to make. So it's pretty fragile and requires a lot of manual intervention to get it to work just right. And a clever obfuscation is possible, even though the authors of these papers note that it's not quite being utilized yet. And there are these things called mixed services, which promise to mix different people's Bitcoins together. And if you're a thief who's just stolen 25,000 Bitcoins, that's probably not going to help you because there's not enough volume in these services to mix that kind of money. But if you're a general user who's interested in privacy, these mixed services could be of helpful to you. So the final word has not yet been written, and in particular, if you're considering the most interesting use case of someone who's really clever at covering their tracks versus a very committed adversary who can analyze the transaction graph as well as has subpoena power, we don't quite know the answer to that yet. Who's going to have the upper hand in that situation? So let me summarize most of what I've said, and then I'll leave you with one final sort of open direction for this line of research. The summary of what I've said so far is that if we consider three different types of users or entities in Bitcoin, the first is a service provider or hub or very identifiable user. then it's easy, even for the general public, looking at the transaction graph, to put labels on these service providers. Right? I mean, it requires a lot of effort, but it's not an open problem. And certainly then if you have subpoena power, that's also easy. Now a typical user, for the general public, this looks currently unlikely. You can track their flow to Modocs or something, but then how are you going to attach identity? Don't really have a way. But if you have subpoena power, then that is likely possible, as researchers show. Now, if you're a paranoid user and pretty clever at covering your tracks, I think it's pretty unlikely, given what we know so far, that someone just looking at the transaction graph is going to be able to attach an identity to them. And it's pretty unclear also, if you have subpoena power, what's going to happen to this situation. So the bottom right box, and also what happens with the typical user when the general public is looking at the transaction graph, I think those are both good research directions for future research, and I think as the use case of Bitcoin changes, the answers to these might change. So let me leave you just with one concluding thought, which is that another entirely different approach has been suggested. This is by Dan Kaminsky all the way back in a 2011 talk, which is you can observe the P2P network, basically make connections to all of these nodes, and use that to associate Bitcoin addresses with IP addresses. There are two papers that are coming out recently that have looked at this. I won't have time to go into the details of those, but I just wanted to say that they've taken first steps, but there's a lot of future promise in this direction. And I'll leave you with these predictions, which is that I predict that this approach of using the transaction graph analysis for de-anonymization might move to machine learning instead of heuristics, and that might be a lot more powerful. And also, the approach of listening to the peer-to-peer network has a lot more promise, and we're going to see more efforts in that direction. And I think that combining these two approaches is going to hugely improve the power of these de-anonymization approaches. So really, we're only close to the beginning of this research rather than the end of it, and I think a lot of the interesting questions are yet to be investigated. I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. If you want to ask a question, you can either go to the side or ask for one of the microphones to be brought to you. I have a question. In the previous slide, you said that you can map the IP address. Do users use any onion routers when they announce their...
That's a good question. Some subset of people do, and we don't know what subset that is. But we can say that if you're using Tor and you're not accepting incoming connections, that's a key nuance, then you might be generally pretty safe. But if you're accepting incoming connections, then it probably doesn't matter if you're using Tor because the incoming connection is still at your IP address. Other questions?
Is it possible that the academic papers about heists stopped short of naming possible suspects because of fear of being sued for libel? And do you know if the information that they dug up is being used by entities that do have subpoena power to follow up on those cases?
I certainly do not know the answer to the latter question, but I will give you one tidbit that might be relevant there. When the Silk Road operator was arrested, the FBI found his identity, at least according to the court filing, not by using any of these methods, not by de-anonymizing Bitcoin itself, and I found this really fascinating, but instead by exploiting something silly that he did on a forum once, which is that he had his original identity as a programmer, and at some point he switched to his Silk Road identity as the Dread Pirate Roberts, and accidentally he made a forum post confusing those two identities, and that was used in order to link these two identities together. It had nothing to do with the Bitcoin transaction graph itself. And so perhaps at this stage, all the stupid things that criminals do outside of Bitcoin are easy enough for law enforcement to go after without even having to go through